So this is an oral history interview being conducted as part of the LGBT Unitarian Voices project, a project of the General Assembly of Unitarian and Free Christian Churches. My name is Reverend Rory Castle-Jones. I'm the Communications Officer for the General Assembly, and I'm conducting the interview. And our interviewee is Mr. Derek McAuley, former Chief Officer of the General Assembly. And we're conducting the interview today online via Zoom. I am in South Wales and Derek is at home in London. And the date today is the 7th of February, 2023. So we're going to begin our interview now.
Thank you, Rory.
Well, our first question to begin with, Derek, is just to ask you why you were interested in being part of this project, the LGBT Unitarian Voices project, and perhaps if you could say a little bit about that and why the project is important to you.
Thank you, Rory. I think it's the project's important because we need to place on record the actions and steps and our involvement as a denomination within the whole arena of LGBT plus rights over several decades. This is probably a timely occasion to do that. And it's good to look back. It's good to also remember the struggles that people went through and not to look back on the past with rose-tinted glasses. Some people had a really difficult time, but it was through their struggles, through their difficulties, that we all benefit today. And I think we should mark that and honor those individuals and groups within our movement.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thank you for being part of the project. I wonder next if you could tell us your story, really, in your own words, in terms of your personal life story and also your role within the Unitarian movement as well.
Yeah, I come from a Northern Ireland Presbyterian background. I moved to England 36 years ago. I was in a mainstream Presbyterian church, brought up in that environment, was quite active within the church. Then with my own developing recognition of my sexual orientation, there came a point where I couldn't reconcile the two. So I was outside faith community for a long time, but I was searching for a community, searching for something that would bring together and enable me to have an integrated life in a sense. And I over the years I'd come across Unitarianism, Unitarian churches, but it was only at a point in my life where I was ready to take that step. So one Sunday morning, I walked into Cross Street Chapel in central Manchester. I was made very welcome. It was a very accepting community. It was a very small community right in the city centre, but in a most wonderful new building. The people were very welcoming. And I knew fairly quickly that was where, I had found my spiritual home, which Unitarians often say, looking back. But for me, it was the beginning of a journey within this movement. And at 2009, I applied for the position of Chief Officer, having been involved within the chapel and in a couple of having attended the annual meetings. I felt I had something to contribute, and clearly others who in that selection process did. So I then moved to London at the end of 2009.
Great, thank you. And I know we're going to hear a bit more in the interview about what happened next, and specifically within the changes for LGBT people during that time, and in your role as chief officer, how you contributed to that. So the next question is, in your experience, whether you've seen changes for LGBT plus people in the Unitarian movement in the time that you've been involved.
During the various as chief officer and probably before, I was very conscious of having clarity about where we as a movement stood on LGBT rights within the overall framework of social responsibility, as it was called, and then faith and public issues. So having an awareness of, again, the struggles within our movement, with the General Assembly on several occasions addressing the issue of LGBT rights and equality, and one can look back through those series of resolutions of gradual acceptance, both opening ministry to people regardless of their background or identity, expressing our abhorrence of discrimination against individuals on the basis of their sexual orientation, which obviously drew upon long-standing Unitarian free Christian views on on equality, and then an acceptance of an equal age of consent following on in 1984, the repeal, then wanting the repeal of Clause 28 of the Local Government Act, and then a calling for the equal acceptance of gay people in all walks of life, which that was a very that stream of resolutions over time was very radical if you compare that to the mainstream Christian denominations and other faith groups. So if one looks back now again at those struggles, it was not, those resolutions were not passed without a lot of detailed argument, having to convince the movement that that LGBT rights are totally within the mainstream Unitarian views over the years and entirely in line with those. If you go back to the 1960s, you can even find traces where Unitarian ministers were talking about the possibility of acceptance of LGBT partner relationships in some legal form or other, and then into the 70s, the blessings by a few, you have to emphasize, not many ministers of gay relationships. So we have to remember the pioneers like Keith Gilley and others, and pioneers like Dudley Cave within Golders Green. So we have to remember those. But and I think if you compare that to the situation today, where right across our movement, LGBT people are accepted in the main, it doesn't mean in every congregation. Same-sex marriage isn't available in every congregation for a whole range of reasons. Some congregations take part in pride marches in their local town or city. Others don't, or don't have the capacity, don't do that sort of thing, more generally. So I think you've probably got a mixed picture, as in society generally. I think that where people know LGBT people, that's when acceptance starts. If it's us and them, people don't think it's an issue for them. So why would we register for same-sex marriage? We don't know anyone gay. So I think we've seen dramatic changes over, that last 30 years, but we've also seen dramatic changes in society. You know, the whole concept of same-sex marriage was probably inconceivable 15 years ago, 15, certainly 30 years ago. So, and when you have mainstream Christian churches now coming on board and having, you know, opening up to same-sex marriage, that's a big step forward. When you have the Methodist Church, for example, 1 million members, you know, that's a substantial denomination. But we led the way in many ways with our friends in liberal Judaism and the Quakers, and others have followed. And I'm, you know.
Thank you. Yeah, that leads very nicely into the next question, which is about how the Unitarian movement's been involved in that struggle to recognise LGBT plus people's rights. We've mentioned same-sex marriage and other areas. So wondered if you could say a little bit more about that in recent years, but also before, perhaps, as well.
Yeah, I think I've dealt probably with the period before I became chief officer. Apart from, clearly the government had introduced civil partnerships, but that was purely a civil ceremony in the local town hall, or where it was purely civil marriage. Not marriage, civil partnerships. That was under the Labour government. Interestingly, the first step probably on our journey was in 2008, when the General Assembly supported a resolution initially proposed by the Oxford congregation, asking for civil partnerships to be performed in places of worship, which in one sense was a bit of a contradiction, because the very term civil partnership was there to make it very clear that this was a civil ceremony, not a religious one. So to put that forward, we were pushing at the boundaries and at the intention, and that was passed by the Assembly. I don't think there was any consideration at that time nationally within government that this was going to happen, and it was only during the passing of the Equality Bill when there was an amendment by Lord Alley in 2009, asking that civil partnerships could take place on religious premises, and that became part of the Equality Act. It's probably true to say that Unitarians weren't terribly involved in the public discussion about that matter. There was an attempt, I think, by certainly some politicians, certainly, and particularly in the House of Lords, to derail that whole amendment, and that was, you know, fortunately rejected. And at that time, I did release a statement with liberal Jews and the Quakers, saying that the right to say no should also have the freedom to say yes. And actually, when the legislation was passed, Cross Street Chapel in Manchester was the very first religious premises in England and Wales to take advantage of that provision. And I understand that Ollet Road Church in Liverpool was where the first registration took place in 2012. So again, Unitarians led the way. You then move on to, well, same-sex marriage. We had the new coalition government. The whole concept, again, of same-sex marriage was not in the coalition agreement. But in September 2011, Lynn Featherstone announced that she would consult on the implementation of equal civil marriage. Again, that emphasis on civil. The politicians probably afraid to go down the religious route in case they would offend, particularly the Church of England. That was welcomed by the opposition at the time. So we then got involved with a coalition of faith groups to support same-sex marriage in religious premises. So the Quakers, the liberal Judaism, and then the movement for Reform Judaism. And so we were small in number, but I think we did have an impact beyond our size. In fact, at the time, we were attacked by a coalition for marriage, not equal marriage, coalition for marriage, that we were given a disproportionate amount of time in the debate, at the expense of, quote, mainstream Christian people. So we clearly were having an impact. We were also at the time very supportive of the Cutting Edge Coalition, which again brought together a whole range of faith groups, trade union groups, education groups, LGBT groups within political parties, again to tackle faith-based homophobia and transphobia. The view clearly was that religious freedom, which of course we support strongly, is not an excuse for reducing human rights. And that coalition again was again part of that whole debate. So I can look back 2012, we actually met with Yvette Cooper, the then opposition Home Secretary. We were getting the support of the then Deputy Prime Minister, who was coming on board for his personal support for those religious bodies that wanted to host same-sex marriages. Nick Clegg said it wasn't the government's place to ban us from performing same-sex marriage. And then the Prime Minister indicated his support for same-sex marriage in churches, and that we could, churches and religious organizations would be able to opt in to perform same-sex marriages, which was a major change of policy, and that appeared in legislation. I think probably the most significant thing that I did was to appear before the House of Commons Public Bills Committee in February 2013, and this was part of the legislative scrutiny of the bill, and I appeared with a colleague from the Quakers, and we were grilled by a number of the MPs, and I remember in particular, having to refute strongly a Democratic Unionist Party member of that committee on the principle of religious freedom. The legislation was passed in May 2013, and then in July in the House of Lords, and received a royal assent. So it was there was some quite offensive debates during that period. It was a bit of a roller coaster. It was probably the most influential contribution that Unitarians made to public life in Britain for probably 50 years, if not more, probably since the post-war discussions on education. I think looking back, we as a movement, both at a very local level and also at a national level, where we did have an impact on that debate. Lynn Featherstone, the minister, who started the process, she in her book does highlight the fact that the three liberal groups working together played an important part in changing the narrative, that it was not religious people versus secular, but actually there were some people of faith were very much in favor of LGBT rights.
Thank you for sharing that that story and that insight really valuably. I think that brings us up to pretty much to the present day. And so the next question is about, as we look forward, what your hopes might be for the future of LGBT plus people, both within the Unitarian movement, but also in wider society as well.
Clearly, there is still work to be done within the wider Unitarian movement to make sure that we have this issue. All congregations are independent and they each have their own flavor, and that's good. And that's our but we need to make sure that the messages that are sent out nationally about being welcoming and accepting on a whole range of issues, identities, and not just LGBT plus issues, are actually reflected in every congregation on the ground. And that is about persuasion and working with people, supporting people, particularly in smaller congregations and the older congregations. This has often been an issue of intergenerational. Young people don't have a problem. I think it is so, but not exclusively. Many older people have been very supportive of change. They've had their own experiences. That they've known people who were gay and have worked. I think the trans issue is one that we had a conversation needs to be had, and clearly at the General Assembly in 2022, there were a resolution and a debate on that issue. Very powerful contributions, very important debate. There's a lot within there is conflict around that issue within general society, and I think we as a group can make a contribution towards that debate around the acceptance. There's a growing anti-trans lobby manipulated by some populist forces in society, with lots of scare stories, many of which, of course, are very similar to the scare stories that were used about gay men in the military, in single-sex environments. So, that is, and then the whole recognition of non-binary, fluidity, different identities, which some of that is reflected in the latest census figures, which make quite interesting reading, and the whole concept of what it means to be queer going forward. We have to ensure, of course, that these debates don't take place in a little gay LGBT bubble, but that we engage with those who are interested and supportive, but are confused on occasion, like many of us are sometimes. So we need to see where the Unitarian movement can contribute in going forward, building on what we've achieved and the changes that we've undergone in the last 30, 40 years.
Great, thank you. I wanted to ask as well, if you could say a little bit about your personal experience as in your role working as the chief officer as a gay man, and how holding that very senior position within the denomination over a decade, what that experience was like, and how you felt in that position.
Yeah, when I was appointed, I was very aware that as all of us in jobs, we all bring our own knowledge, our backgrounds, our experience, our interests, and we're probably at our best when in our work life reflects those experiences and background and interests, and I think that applied to me. It applies to ministers and others who work within our community. So when I was appointed, I didn't want to be seen as the first gay chief officer, or the gay this, the gay that. Being gay is part of my identity, but it's not the only part of my identity. It does raise the issue then of, well, would we have been would we have contributed as much to this debate if I hadn't have been in post? and again, that may have reflected the interest of if someone else had been chief officer at the time, and the degree by which they were interested in social responsibility, public affairs more generally. For me, that was partly what drew me to the post, given the Unitarian long historical and active engagement in public life, in building a better society. That's what draws me to Unitarianism to some extent. It drew me to the role as chief officer. So taking forward that faith and public issues agenda was for me important. And I was able to use clearly the networks that I already had and could develop to benefit and to enable us as a movement to contribute more widely. So within the Cutting Edge Consortium, where we, as I mentioned before, that engagement with trade unions, on several occasions I was at TUC House. We had contacts with the British Humanist Association. We had contacts with other faith groups. So, I was able to use some of those relationships and contacts to our benefit, and enable Unitarians to have a bigger impact than they would otherwise have done, because in many ways, issuing the occasional press statement is not going to affect public policy. Why would they listen to a small movement? So actually being able to use those contacts, I think, proved invaluable.
Great, thank you. One other thing I wanted to ask about was within the Unitarian movement for many years, many decades, there's been there's always been LGBT people, of course, who are Unitarians. But for many decades, there's been informal networks, I suppose, of lesbian and gay people, LGBT people, and often those have been not formalized. There's no paper trail, there's no minutes, there's no agendas left for us. They're informal networks of people, and I think that continues today as well. So I wondered if there was anything you could tell us or mention about that, and maybe the role those networks have played in helping LGBT Unitarians support each other, and maybe also make change within the denomination as well.
Yes, I probably came in at the end of that period. There was an informal group that gathered at each of the annual meetings, usually at the end of the day, one evening. It was in the program that I recall, but there was never a formal group. I think one of the members of the group paid for the slot, for example, and then individuals had been were willing to be publicly identified as the contacts on the famous pink leaflet. So it was, unlike other denominations, it was never formalized in the same way. So and now, in a sense, maybe because of the acceptance, a formal LGBT group would probably not, LGBT plus group would probably not be as relevant. I think that was a reflection of the time, and our size. I think had we have been bigger, we probably could have formalized things a bit more, but it was very reliant, I think, on a small number of people. And then when there was the annual meeting, I think I recall maybe 15 people there, that sort of scale out of the 300. at those annual meetings. And then there was those who were involved in various writing, I think had an important influence as well.
Great, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. We've covered a lot, a lot of ground. Is there anything else that you want to share that you think is important to share or to put on record in our interview this morning?
I think one of the important things is how we negotiate the Unitarian commitment to religious freedom. I'm active in the International Association for Religious Freedom, which evolved out of, and very dependent on Unitarians, the value of religious freedom for us. At the same time, discussing LGBT plus rights when religious freedom is being used, particularly in the United States and in Eastern Europe, to promote anti-gay legislation, anti-gay attitudes, and that actually people of faith are using religious freedom to oppress the freedom of others. And I think there's a role there for Unitarians globally to speak out and challenge that agenda. Something we need to do more of. And at the last Europe and Middle Eastern conference, online conference of IARF, we did have a presentation as keynote speaker, a liberal rabbi who talked about his experience as a gay man. So I think that's something that we could pick up and need to a bit more strongly. The role of the small liberal faith groups, ourselves, the Quakers, Reformed Jews, liberal Jews, and others within the wider faith community in promoting within interfaith work, and maybe not staying quiet. And because in my experience, many of the what works within interfaith can also work within relationships between LGBT people and straight people in faith groups and in other arenas. The values of respect, equality, acknowledgement, openness, underpin a tolerant and free society, where acceptance should be the basis for how we live together. So again, that's something Unitarians have been committed to interfaith work and building relationships. So I think we can develop that going forward as well.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that and for everything, for giving your time and being willing to share so much of your experience and your insight into all of that. And unless there's anything else that you would like to share at this stage, I think we can draw the interview to a close.
No, thank you, Rory, and I've enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing how the project evolves. And if what I will finish off is the Same-Sex Marriage Act sent to me and signed by Maria Miller, the Secretary of State responsible. So
that's a perfect way to end the interview.